All right, welcome everybody. It's a big pleasure to welcome you all here on behalf of the VUB. You will be welcomed on behalf of the ULB, our sister university, or I should say our mother university. In a couple of minutes, I'm the Vice Rector for Research at VUB. And since the topic of this afternoon, or one of the topics of this afternoon, is academic freedom, I was asked to say maybe a little bit about that subject. In fact, at VUB, we approved last year, we approved the new charter of the researcher, and that charter is one that every researcher at VUB has to comply with. And that delineates a number of obligations, but also a number of freedoms that I think are crucial in this debate. And it's also important to distinguish between different freedoms. There are three types of freedoms that we talk about in that charter. And the first one is basically the freedom or the autonomy of the university. And that means that we as a university, we are a free university, Vrije Universiteit, oh no, it's not there. Vrije Universiteit of Brussels means that we are not let's say a neutral university, but we are a value-driven, we are a free university. We were founded together with ULB as free from church and state, free from the meddlings of church and state. We are a value-driven organization, and that means that it doesn't mean that we as a university have to be an activist university, but it does mean that we have a responsibility to speak out, always with a sense of responsibility, with a sense of reason, with a sense of those values that we represent, and with a sense of international law. I just came from Antwerp, where the VUB, together with University of Ghent and University of Antwerp, granted an honorary doctorate. It was the first time that the three universities granted one together to Francesca Albanese. We got a lot of criticism for that, but again, with a view of speaking out for reason, speaking out for international law, we thought that was important. The second freedom that we delineate is the academic freedom, but on the level of the individual researcher. And that is sometimes not understood. Academic freedom is first and foremost at the level of the individual researcher. It protects the individual not just against the outside world, but also against their own university, against their own university authorities, I would say. And then, of course, well, I am one of those authorities, then I have to say immediately that freedom is, of course, not absolute, because academic freedom, on the one hand, it grants you a whole amount of freedom. On the other hand, it also means responsibility. It means adhering to scientific standards, always being open for peer review and peer criticism. And then the final freedom that we talk about in the charter, and again it is related, but it is something else, is freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is basically about the world of opinions. And those can go further than what you have researched. They can pertain to also what you put on social media. But it's something different than academic freedom. That is the realm of opinions, and there basically we ask our employees to adhere to the legal boundaries of freedom of speech, and that is not calling for violence and not calling for hate or discrimination. And so those three values, they are mixed, they are muddled, and it's not easy to distinguish, but I think it's very important to distinguish them. And those three freedoms, they can sometimes clash. Sometimes the autonomy of the university clashes with the academic freedom, and sometimes that clashes with freedom of speech. It's not an easy debate, but a very important one, and so therefore I'm glad that you are here so numerously, because these are very important, very relevant debates to be had. And to be had also here in BRIAS, the Institute for Advanced Studies of the VUB and the ULB. We are now in our fourth year, fifth year, something like that. It's still new, it's still fresh. There is a program now on democratic governance, and so this fits democratic governance, democratic resilience. This really fits, the lecture that you will hear really fits within that theme. So I'm really glad that you are all here. I'm really glad that our speaker is here, and I wish you all a very stimulating and enlightening debate. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students. It is a great pleasure to welcome you today at U Square, this shared site of the Université Libre de Bruxelles and Vrije Universiteit Brussels, a place that reflects our shared commitment to openness, cooperation, and academic dialogue. VUB and ULB, which were until the early 70s one single university, have a long-standing tradition of defending academic freedom and supporting scholars at risk. This commitment is deeply rooted in our common history. From hosting refugees during the dictatorship of Salazar in Portugal and Franco in Spain, to supporting exiled academics during the regime of Pinochet in Chile, our universities have consistently stood on the side of those whose freedom to think, to teach, and research was under threat. Today, this commitment is embodied in various concrete and lasting mechanisms. Among them, I would like to mention the ULB's Khaled al-Assad Solidarity Fund, which was created in 2016 and which provides sustained support to postdoctoral researchers at risk, enabling them to continue their work in a safe academic environment. Each year, the fund supports several scholars from across the world, threatened because of their research, their ideas, or their commitment to truth. Since its creation, we have welcomed researchers from countries which are very diverse, from Turkey, Syria, Iran, Russia, China, Cameroon, Burundi, and I can mention many other countries of origin, reflecting the global scale, persistence, and growing intensity of the risks faced by researchers and academics today. The fund is one example of our actions in the field. Together, these actions form a coherent and enduring policy, not only to affirm our values, but to translate them into concrete support. Such support is also illustrated by the close collaboration VUB and ULB entertain with the Scholars at Risk network. It is within this broader framework that we are particularly pleased to welcome Professor Mark Bray, who has himself become the target in the US of intense harassment and serious threats from far-right movements. These threats led him to make the difficult decision to leave the US with his family and seek safety in Spain. His experience reminds us of the very real challenges faced by scholars whose work or ideas put them at risk. And it shows us, of course, that one should not take academic freedom for granted. Professor Bray, dear Mark, we are really honored to welcome you here at ULB and VUB Your presence among us gives a very concrete resonance, I would say, to the values we strive to uphold. Thank you for being with us here. We're looking forward, of course, to your lecture. And I would like also to take the opportunity to thank very much our colleagues and Brias, of course, to have organized this conference. So many thanks to Professor David Paternotte, Archibald Gustin, Benoît Henriet, et Benjamin Declaine. Thank you.
So well, thanks again, Bryce, for welcoming us here. And it was extremely easy and smooth to work together. And they were very enthusiastic about this invitation. So thanks a lot. So the idea briefly of why we have decided to invite Mark is... oh, sorry. Oh. That was okay to be Anna. So what we have tried to do with a group of colleagues, also from other universities, not only the VUB and the ULBs, we have started to work and to think about how we deal with the extreme, and especially with the far right in all universities. And the idea is to invite or to talk as a way to start with that conversation with colleagues who have actually faced that sort of attacks in other contexts. And it's how very rapidly in the brainstorming sessions we had, Mark's names came saying, well, this is probably someone we should try to talk to. And so we could reach him. That was also very smooth and easy. So thanks for coming, for accepting. And Mark was in Brussels this week, so that was also the other easy thing. So we decided to invite him for this lecture. And just to be very brief, so Mark is a professor of modern history at Rutgers University in the United States, and he has worked on modern Spain, which is important also for the other connections. So working on the history of anarchism, anti-fascism, and I will come back to that in a moment, but also for this university on the history of Francisco Ferrer and the modern school, which is central to the history of the ULB and the VUB. And as Anne has already mentioned, and Mark will go further into that, so he's very famous for his book on Antifa that was translated or will be translated in 6 languages. So it's Portuguese, French, so you don't need to speak English if you want to read it, Spanish, Italian, but also I've just learned Japanese and Greek are coming soon. And because of this book and his research on anti-fascism, he was targeted by different organizations and different political actors, including Turning Point, so the organization that was led by Charlie Kirk, so the guy who was murdered, that probably have heard of. And then he was specifically targeted because of his work on anti-fascism. And it's also why, as Anne said, he had to flee to Spain to be able to continue his work and his teaching. So, Mark, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Wow. Great turnout. Thanks for coming. Given that this is organized by 2 universities and an institute, the number of thank yous is a little overwhelming. But thank you, David. Thank you to everyone at the VUB and the ULB. Thank you to Anya, Benjamin, Benoit. I'm sorry, the number of names, it's been a whirlwind, but it's been a pleasure to meet everyone. So what I'm going to do today is speak about what I've been through personally over the past half year, a bit about the book, trajectories of fascism and anti-fascism in the U.S., and what that may mean moving forward in the U.S. and in Europe. Before I get to that, a note on standing versus sitting. In Spain, all the talks are sitting down. The speaker's sitting down, always sitting down. And in the US, an event like this would be standing up. So in a sense, I feel a little bit more at home with the standing up. So I appreciate that. So it's lovely to be here, although it's not fully spring weather yet. It's lovely to be here this spring. But it wasn't my plan to be in Europe this spring. It was to be in the US teaching my students in person. But as a number of you probably heard, I was targeted in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk shooting for a book I had written 8 years earlier, which... as we academics know, if you published a book 8 years ago, usually no one is contacting you at all about that book. But this is the kind of contacting I did not want. And I ended up here. So let's talk a little bit about fascism. Fascism is a notoriously difficult concept to define, in part because historically fascists have been ambivalent, if not dismissive, of rational consistency, right? Mussolini famously said, "Do I contradict myself? I don't give a damn," right? But I think that as a historian, it's helpful to think of anti-fascism and fascism historically. So fascism was, among other things, an effort to take forms of popular politics mobilized by what we might in retrospect refer to as the left, by socialists and anarchists and trade union political parties and organizations, where you would have big rallies and newspapers and youth organizations and women's organizations. And that thrust of popular activity, which was largely alien to reactionary politics in the 19th century. Right? During that time, if you look at the suppression of the Paris Commune, for example, right, the reactionary forces would kill a bunch of rabble-rousers and Reds, but largely they did not want to fundamentally transform the fabric of society, and they didn't want people mobilized. They wanted social control to continue to be exerted by those traditional forms such as the church, social organizations, the family, and society, right? But fascism, it's no coincidence that Mussolini was a socialist before he became a fascist, aims to take those forms of social mobilization that the left had gained a lot of political ground with, but drain their content, repurpose their content. Instead of internationalism, ultranationalism. Instead of women's rights and feminism, misogyny. And use those forms of popular politics to, paradoxically, use modern forms of politics to return to a past, right? They view the aftermath of the French Revolution in the modern political world as their enemy, as this kind of corrosive force destroying allegedly natural hierarchies of domination, and they wanted to return. So I think of it in terms of, sometimes I talk to my students about the movie Back to the Future, which increasingly they don't even know what that is. But the movie Back to the Future, right? There's a Back to the Future. They want to use modernity to destroy modernity, or at least so they claim. Thinking of violence as this inherently cleansing force, not just a means to an end, right? To destroy those who they accuse of distorting natural hierarchies, in which case I was speaking to Archibald earlier. I did get your name, right? Yeah, all right. I had this moment where I was like, oh no, I just called someone the wrong name. About gender being like absolutely central to what fascism was back then and to what far-right and fascist politics are today. So, a little gloss on that. Let's turn to the U.S. The story's a little different in the U.S. Robert Paxton, the historian Robert Paxton, said that maybe in a functional sense, the first proto-fascist formation in history were the KKK after the American Civil War, right? They've got not the same outfits as the black shirts or the brown shirts, but it's an outfit-based sort of vigilante form of suppressing a marginalized group through redemptive violence. You can see some threads. But of course, the story is much deeper than that, right? Hitler was very influenced by American eugenics programs. He was very inspired by the American example of the genocide of the indigenous population, depopulating the American West as his vision of depopulating Eastern Europe. So in that sense, the influences in terms of the history of far-right politics have gone both ways. It's also, I think, helpful to throw into the conversation the argument made by Ami Césaire and others that Hitlerism was a form of European imperialism or colonialism brought home to Europe. And that's something that I think is a really keen observation and is essential to this conversation. So if we think about it that way, did the U.S. have fascism? I would reverse the question. I wouldn't say that what the U.S. had was fascism so much as fascism was this sort of subset of imperialism, and therefore, connected to that, I think we can think of anti-fascism as a historical subset of anti-colonialism or anti-imperialism. And in that way, the U.S. has that kind of imperial legacy, right? It is empire. It is genocide. You see why the far right loves me, right, in the U.S. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to talk about changes in American far-right politics, particularly after World War II. So there's a book, I don't know if it's been translated into French, but if it has not, someone should get on it. I think it's really good. Joseph Franzak, historian at Princeton University, wrote this really neat book called Everything is Possible. And he makes two really great arguments that I think are largely, if not entirely true, but you can decide for yourselves. And don't throw tomatoes at me if you disagree with these. Throw tomatoes at him. But the first is that prior to the mid-1930s, fascism and anti-fascism were really pretty much paradigms that were exclusively reserved to Italy and the Italian diaspora. And it was not until Hitler took power and you have far-right groups around the world more actively copying the fascists that fascism expanded to become not an Italian-specific term, but a broader international term, and simultaneously anti-fascism. That one's pretty cool. The far more mind-blowing one is that the left, as we know it today, as this transnational, nebulous, historical actor that can be said to do things collectively, that interpretation of the left, he argues, didn't exist in political discourse prior to the mid-1930s. That when people talked about the left prior to that, they were referring to specific groups of parliamentarians or specific branches of certain parties. They weren't talking about it in globalized terms. Implicit in that is that the same thing can be said of the right. So in that sense, if we're following him on that, and you can decide whether you want to or not, the left is anti-fascism in the 30s, and the right is more or less fascism. In the US, after World War II, we certainly had the patriotic narrative of, we beat the Nazis. No one else participated in that, just Americans, by the way. Just so you're clear. No, but that is what a lot of the American far right would have you believe. We beat the Nazis, but we didn't do so in the name of anti-fascism. Anti-fascism was still a term in the US associated with the left, associated with, for example, the members of the Abraham Lincoln Battalion who went over to fight in the Spanish Civil War and then came back to the US and were blacklisted for their alleged or real communist politics. So in the era of McCarthyism, which for those of you who are not as familiar with American history and politics was the kind of the Red Scare of the 1950s, there were liberals and conservatives, but people didn't really talk of themselves as left and right because it was sort of associated with being a fascist or an anti-fascist in a way that was kind of outside the mainstream of American politics. Moving into the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement was a very successful historical social movement that normalized in mainstream society an antagonism towards racism. And so a huge shift happens after that where the mainstreams of both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, establish a kind of superficial, you could call it in the most minimal sense, anti-racist consensus. Both political parties, the mainstreams agree that racism is bad, but then they also agree that, guess what, racism's over. It was bad, but it's over, right? And when that happens, important shifts happen with the American far right, who are not down with that even superficial anti-racist consensus. One thing that happens is you get the development of more of a kind of anti-state far-right insurgency. There's a writer named Matthew Lyons who wrote a book called Insurgent Supremacists. It's I don't know if it's been translated into English, but it's very good and it covers that shift and all the different political permutations of what that means. But that's the sort of historical thread towards, for example, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, is those kinds of anti-state, far-right, white supremacist insurgents who view the American state from around the era of the civil rights movement onward as no longer protecting white supremacy, but being, depending on the flavor of description, secretly controlled by the Jews. And here you can see, although France can take the credit for the Great Replacement theory, there were elements of it in the ether all over prior to that, and you can see it starting to bubble up at this point as well as sort of thinking about the deep state, which interestingly enough was a concept that sort of was developed by left and right-wing figures, but has subsequently become pretty much an exclusively right-wing concept as far as I can tell. And this superficial anti-racist consensus survives through, in what I would argue, draining a lot of progressive and left-wing discourse into a kind of seemingly neutral liberal language. So take, for example, what we thought of as discrimination, or even how we described racism in the U.S. as at a mainstream level. Right? When I was a kid, growing up, white kid, suburban New Jersey, racism was mistreating someone based on the color of their skin. Now that dehistoricized, decontextualized description created the opportunity for the far right to say, hey, I have white skin, so policies that give opportunities to people of color are discriminating against me because of the color of my skin, right? So that's one of a number of examples, which I'll come to later, of how this kind of liberal discourse created space for the far right to normalize their ideas in the US in a way that led to where they are now. This started to change, I guess you could argue, with, well, the end of the Cold War was a big moment where a lot of the far right, as much as they hated the American state for civil rights, was still sort of allied with the American state because of their anti-communism and their opposition to the Soviet Union. When the Cold War ended, there was less of an incentive to do that, right? We get the really growth of the militia movement in the United States. I understand there are fewer guns in these kinds of countries than over there, but there's an awful lot of guns in the US. And there's an awful lot of groups of usually white men out in the woods with guns. And so you see that really take off in the 90s. And then Obama becoming the first African-American president, right, with the election of 2008. And the subsequent decade, the last decade, from about, let's say, 2011 with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I participated in New York City, up through Black Lives Matter, feminist organizing, Me Too, LGBTQ organizing, opposition to oil pipeline construction. We had this incredible decade of social movements and progressive left-wing politics in the US, right during and after the first African-American president. And this is where this superficial anti-racist consensus falls apart completely on both sides. On the one side, you have Black Lives Matter, which is, you know, the most profound American social movement we had probably since the 70s, saying, no, look, racism is still very much alive and never went anywhere, to the point where Hillary Clinton, as mainstream a Democratic politician as you can find, is sort of forced to admit that structural racism continues to be a problem in the US. On the other side, you have the Republican Party with the development of what was coming to be called by around 2014 the alt-right, the alternative right, starts to say a couple of different things. One, there's one version of it that says, nuh-uh, no, it's not a real thing. And then another slightly less popular one that says, yes, it is, but that's a good thing. And you see both of those, they're kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth frequently. Let's pause a little bit to talk a little bit about the alt-right. So throughout all of these difficulties, I've had the fortune of meeting a lot of really great researchers. So there's a plus. And I met this researcher in Madrid, an American person who's researching the development of the alt-right out of all of this very bizarre network of different kinds of people involved with Gamergate and explicit white supremacists and Nazi organizations and neo-Confederates and incels. Is that a term that's made its way over here? Incels? Sorry. But it wasn't until journalists started writing about it as this thing, taking the term coined by Richard Spencer and other white supremacists a few years earlier, that people in this movement started to say, yeah, we are part of the alt-right. So it's funny how the media and discourse can influence things. But anyway, in this context, I think you can see the rise of Trump's presidency the first time around, both as him pushing the alt-right forward, but also being pushed by it. There's this sort of, I think, a reciprocal influence. And race was absolutely central to it. This is the context of protests against Confederate statues and monuments around the US, which the right tried to portray as history. But actually, most of those monuments were not created right after the American Civil War. In the 19th century, they were mostly created during the era of civil rights in the 60s and 70s as ways to intimidate African-American populations. So that's the history that it really is. Plus, of course, I mean, I'm speaking to a room full of academics. I don't need to convince you of this. But if they really cared so much about history, why are they defunding universities and archives and libraries? But I digress. Anyway, race was certainly central to that. So was gender, right? This is the context of Me Too and cancel culture, of the manosphere, books written by pickup artists, the aggravations of incels. Another book, I like to recommend books because I know there's always someone who's like, yeah, I'll check that out. It's On Microfascism, written by Jack Bradich, a colleague of mine at Rutgers. On Microfascism makes this case for gender and misogyny being at the center of fascism. It's a good book. So the alt-right develops and tries to position itself as its own space in mainstream American politics, largely through the internet, largely through social media and videos and 4chan and Reddit, but also by establishing their own street presence. So you see a lot of these far-right groups starting to feel emboldened, having their own demonstrations, which elicit clashes with anti-racist and anti-fascist activists really starting to get going 2015, 2016. And these efforts peak with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in August of 2017, which, as the name of the rally suggests, Unite the Right, was this effort even while Trump was in office. And I want to remind everyone that, yeah, everyone knew that Trump was a far-right politician, but it wasn't clear at that point exactly how far he'd be able to go, how far he even cared about going with his politics. And so you can see that skepticism even with the far right, that they wanted to establish their own independent street presence in that context. And then there was mobilization from people all across the country to come and oppose them. And they chose Charlottesville because of this conflict over a Confederate monument in Virginia. I was living in New Hampshire at the time. I considered going down, but it was awfully far, and my book was about to come out like a month later, and I was planning on going on tour for months and months and months, so I said, my comrades can handle this one. I'm going to sit this one out. I have a good friend of mine who's currently living in Barcelona because she was being monitored by feds in New York and starting to get very concerned. She's in Barcelona now. But she went to Charlottesville, and she was involved in one of these conflicts with fascists, and she and a bunch of people fled into a church, and the fascists were trying to tear down the doors of the church and attack people inside. It got very intense. A number of people got seriously assaulted, and Heather Heyer was killed when a fascist named James Field drove his car through the crowd. So this is when Trump famously said there were good people on both sides, right? And of course he's been what's the term with like whistling? Dog whistling. I'm sorry. You ever had those moments and you're just like, I know it's a whistle something. Dog whistling. The far right since the beginning, although of course it's become more explicit over time. So this is the context in which I wrote my Antifa book. I don't need to get into the entire backstory. We're not going to be here all day. But I wrote it because it was clear that the far right was becoming more of an explicit threat. It was clear that a lot of people were looking to anti-fascist organizing, but particularly the militant anti-fascist, as it's often referred to in English, the militant anti-fascist tradition, which I argue really consolidated itself as its own tendency within the anti-fascist milieu after World War II in Europe. Its first manifestation of this kind of European-inspired militant anti-fascism in the US was with Anti-Racist Action, which was founded in the late 1980s in Minneapolis and then grew into a national and international network in the 1990s, and then kind of petered off into the mid-2000s. And then subsequently the Torch Network, which exists now, was the inheritor of that legacy. So it was clear that people were looking to this tradition, looking to organize in this tradition, but there was very little in the way of historical scholarship about it. Most historians, and there are several notable exceptions, but most historians around 2017, at least writing in English, viewed anti-fascism as something from the interwar period or World War II, and anyone claiming to be doing anti-fascism after World War II as living in a delusion or engaging in historical memory. And that was not a sufficient explanation, to say the least. And so I wanted to make that historical knowledge available. And I also interviewed more than 60 anti-fascists from 17 different countries. I don't think I spoke to any Belgians, I'm sorry. But I wanted to bring those perspectives, do some comparative analysis to bear for readers there, and I wanted to engage in some of the hot topic debates of the time, which really largely revolved around questions of self-defense and violence and freedom of speech. It's funny that these days when I speak about this in the American media, no one really cares about those two things anymore, but back in 2017, it was all anyone wanted to talk to me about. But we can talk about that in the Q&A if you're really curious, but I'm just going to move it along. So that's the context in which I wrote the book. It was rushed to publication by my publisher about a week after Charlottesville. And so in that context, where Charlottesville was the biggest news story in the American media, my book became the point of reference for talking about the politics of left opposition to the far right. And so I was on all the shows and whatnot. I received quite a few threats, including a number of death threats back then as well. I'm Jewish. Some of them were anti-Semitic. Although my dad is Irish, so Bray is not a Jewish name. So I sometimes wonder if everyone knows that, but I am. And there was a bomb scare at my place of employment. There was no bomb, fortunately, but some professor mailed me a box of books without telling me to expect a box of books. So I was teaching at Dartmouth College at the time, and they freaked out, and they called the police who brought in the bomb squad, and it was just a box of books. But tell people that you're sending them books. Surprises are nice, but just tell them. Anyway, so this was a stressful period of time. It was a difficult period of time. But the far right lost the battle for the streets in the U.S. So how did they lose the battle? They largely lost it, and I think this is interesting to think about maybe differences with what the political dynamics are here, but also how things have changed since then. The far right lost the battle for the streets in the U.S. largely because of doxing, publicizing the personal information of people who do not want that published. So what happened? At the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, a lot of the fascists and far right, predominantly men, did not cover their faces. The night before the main event, there was a tiki torch march on the campus of the University of Virginia, and a lot of those young men returned home to find out that their neighbors and their employers and their universities all knew that they were the ones marching around saying Jews will not replace us, and they got fired from their jobs or disowned by their, the people in their lives. So a year later in 2018, there was an initiative to have the Unite the Right Rally 2, and sequels are never as good as the original, and that was true in this case as well, because all of the leaders of the different far-right factions said, it's not really worth going because you're just going to get doxxed, it's going to ruin your life, don't bother. So you see that with the exception of the Pacific Northwest and a few cities like Berkeley or Portland, Oregon, over the next few years, the far-right largely gives up on organizing big public events because of doxing. And of course, doxing only works if there's social pressure to make being identified as a fascist a problem. If people don't have problems with fascists, then being identified as a fascist is not a problem at all. Now you see much less in the way of anti-fascist doxing in the US because there is less of a social taboo against being a white supremacist, for example, right? But back then there was, or at least there was perceived as being, and this really cratered the ability of fascist and far-right groups to mobilize. They largely gave up on it. And subsequently, the public profile of Antifa groups declined as well, because they show up when they're opposing someone. They're not just going to kind of walk around, and as much as it might be fun, but they're not going to do that, right? So that meant that for me, with the brief exception of 1 week in 2020, when Trump blamed the Black Lives Matter protest movement in response to the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, he blamed that on Antifa. For a week, I had to explain that didn't make any sense. But after that, this all disappeared. I was living in a small town in New Jersey. I have 2 small children. I published another book on turn of the 20th century anarchism. I started researching a book on transnational scams. And actually, I would really have more fun talking to you today about scams in the 19th century through letters than I would talking about this. But maybe I'll come back in 10 years when that book's out. Anyway, everything changed when Charlie Kirk was killed. Did you folks know who he was before he was killed? I see some yeses, some nos. he's certainly become much more well-known in Europe after being killed. I have been told by a number of people that he's more well-known among young people because of the kind of American far-right social media influence here. I don't know. But he was arguably the most important far-right person outside of government at the time, give or take, in the U.S. Co-founder of Turning Point USA, which was an organization that aims to create the illusion of right-wing activism on campus. I don't know how best to say it, but, you know, there is this narrative in the U.S., I don't know if it's also the case here, that activism is only legitimate if it's from everyday people. So they try to kind of create, the term in English sometimes is astroturfing. Instead of grassroots, right, create the impression of. And so initially, Turning Point USA focused on things like freedom of speech, that's been really central to their messaging, and also free market. So they had like T-shirts that said like socialism's not cool, man, and like, you know, try to pretend. And this is part of the story, right, of the far right trying to present themselves as anti-establishment, alternative. Incidentally, no one talks about the alt-right in the U.S. anymore. They just have captured the right. They are the right. So that term has pretty much disappeared, which tells you all you need to know. So anyway, Turning Point USA started out free speech, free market. As Trump became more popular, they became more Trumpian in their rhetoric and messaging, especially if you look at local groups. At a national level, the Republican Party or college Republicans or Turning Point USA, they try to hold on to a semblance of at least a semi-respectable image. If you look at what the local groups are publicizing, and then you find the anti-fascist activists who have like hacked into their group chats, it is just a Nazi free-for-all. I say that without any exaggeration whatsoever. Anyway, Charlie Kirk was killed by, turns out, Tyler Robinson. Before Trump had any information as to who killed him, he started blaming the left. It's the fault of the left, the left, the left. Tyler Robinson, incidentally, cannot, based on what we know, easily be categorized as left or right. He seemed to be more influenced by video games than anything else. But days later, President Trump issued an executive order declaring Antifa to be a terrorist organization, although it is neither an organization nor terrorist. Incidentally, in the U.S., there's no legal apparatus to declare domestic entities as domestic terrorist organizations. So it does not have any legal power, but of course it has power in other ways, and has clearly inspired some things in Europe, which we can talk about later. Not long after that, which was clearly an attempt to, all right, let me back up a little bit, right? It seemed like there has been kind of this concerted effort for 8 years where the right in the U.S. is attempting to say that this thing, Antifa, which they are very loath to define in any meaningful terms, is essentially just kind of the paramilitary wing of the Democratic Party. As if like Nancy Pelosi and the leaders of the Democrats really like want like a paramilitary force. But they look at the example of anti-fascist action in Germany in the early 1930s, and they say German Communist Party, anti-fascist action, Democratic Party, Antifa, as this parallel. And so that's what I've read too much of what fascists write about Antifa, and they take these kernels of historical truth and they just run with them. Anyway. It was clearly a rhetorical game to associate the left or the Democrats with violence. They aimed to expand on these efforts several days later by issuing a statement from the Department of Homeland Security on the Antifa aligned, right? So Antifa is already this vague term. The Antifa aligned is everyone they don't like. And so you can track that down if you search Antifa aligned Department of Homeland Security. You can read it yourself. But the gist of it is that all sorts of nonprofits and progressive organizations are Antifa aligned, that Tyler Robinson or Luigi Mangione, the guy who killed the healthcare CEO, that all of these people are Antifa aligned. And this is around the same time that they issue a national security presidential memorandum on ideas that foment violence. These ideas included anti-Americanism, quote-unquote extremist views on religion, race, gender, or migration. I think migration was in there. Migration was in there, right? Wasn't it? Yeah. And so what we have is a situation where there's a concerted effort by the Trump administration to paint everyone they oppose as, if not directly a terrorist, in one way or another, supporting terrorists or allied with terrorists. A few days later is when the influencers started attacking me. And here what I'm going to try to suggest is that there is this informal network in the US and possibly increasingly in other countries as well of connections between state actors, influencers, organizations that bounce off of each other and foment threats of violence, if not actual violence from below, in a way that gives them plausible deniability. So there's this influencer, Jack Posobiec, who was the guy behind Pizzagate. You've heard of Pizzagate, anyone? If you haven't, Google it. You will be astonished at how stupid it is. But I actually once ate at that pizza place in D.C., the pizza place that they claim. Now, I bet they're going to use that. So, see, he went there. Anyway, he had a major speech at Charlie Kirk's funeral. He wrote one of the fascist books about Antifa. And my book's called Antifa. He called his, which came out a year or two later, The Antifa. And I was like, come up with your own title. But so he started calling me a domestic terrorist professor. Within a few hours, the death threats started. I moved my classes online. It wasn't all that different from what I had experienced 8 years earlier, and my partner got very upset with me for not treating it sufficiently seriously. I have apologized to her profusely for that subsequently. A few days later, another equivalent figure named Andy No started attacking me, and right after he started attacking me, Turning Point USA, the local group on my campus, wrote a petition to have me fired. The petition wanted me to be fired because of my political violence rhetoric, even though I had been working at my university for 6 years without a single complaint. And these students were not only not my students, they were on a different campus in a different city of my university. Also, it became known that they didn't actually write the petition themselves. I doubt they knew who I was. It was written by National, sent down to them, and presented as local activism, right? At the time, the petition had maybe 60, 70 signatures, mostly from non-Rutgers signatories. Nevertheless, Fox News decided, this is a really newsworthy story. Let's write an article about it. And so a few days later, the article came out. And then when the Fox News article came out, believe it or not, there are a lot of Fox News readers, or bots, in the US that use Fox News articles as like lists of people to harass. So within a few hours, the stream of hate mail and threats started coming in. One of them had my home address. That's when I got very concerned, particularly in a country full of guns. I decided that I was going to leave the country, both because I was concerned that the political situation was getting worse and worse at a very quick pace, and because of my kids. I had lived in Madrid for a year or 2 years prior, and if we had gone to another place in the U.S., every day they would have said, can we go home? But if we went across the ocean, they couldn't ask that. You know how it is. If you have a family, like the logistics of that take precedence. I actually wasn't going to tell anyone. I hope my department chair, if she's watching this, doesn't get too upset. But I got permission to teach online, and I was just going to disappear. But I had to tell my students that there's a 6-hour time difference. I can't have synchronous sessions. I'm very sorry. And there was a Reddit thread on my predicament. Some very well-intentioned students said, look what happened to my professor. Isn't this awful? He has to go to Europe. And then Milo Yiannopoulos and Andy No and all of these influencers found that email. And the next morning I woke up and it was all over the internet, the email to my students. The day after that, someone posted my home address in a threatening way on X with information about my family. And what was originally kind of a local news story became national and then international when we were at the airport, at the gate, boarding passes in hand, and at the last moment, my family's flight reservation was mysteriously canceled. Don't know what to this day exactly what happened, but I have no doubt it was politically motivated. And that's when this whole thing kind of blew up. We were rebooked on a flight the next day. We managed to leave the country, but not before I was searched and interrogated by federal agents for an hour before leaving. bear in mind, I've been accused of no crimes. I have committed no crimes. But I'm the one, right, that was under question and under harassment. So we're doing okay on time? Or should I? Well, I'll say a few more things before wrapping it up, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all think. So we talked about, right, the kind of the rise and fall of well, fall is not the right word, the public rise and fall of the alt-right in society. The far right gained power not through the streets, but through social media, through the culture wars, and through the weakness and ineptitude of the Democratic Party. I think that's a part of this as well. And the kind of relatively small network of Antifa groups were the historical product of a strategy to oppose small and medium-sized far-right groups when they're outside of power before they reach the halls of power. Right? That's really, I think, the kind of strategic orientation that it developed after World War II is how do we say never again? We make sure that we treat every white supremacist group as if it could be the seed of another murderous regime. We're beyond that point in the US because the fascists have direct control of the American state and a lot of local state legislatures. Right? So obviously, if we're thinking about anti-fascist histories and strategies, we've entered a different kind of paradigm in the US. And so what would that entail, right? Well, in my mind and the minds of many other people, it would require kind of a mass popular anti-fascism, not of the same style as the 1930s. Those kinds of conditions and considerations certainly don't apply to the United States anymore, but of a different style. And I think the most inspiring example of that is the anti-ICE movement in the US, most famously, but not at all exclusively in Minneapolis. And what have been the forms of organizing there? Well, I mean, I haven't been there myself, right? But from people I've spoken to, from keeping a close eye on it, I can talk about it in broad strokes, right? And that is what I would argue is really a form of community self-defense in the nature of building networks of solidarity between neighbors, migrants, people with papers, people without papers, union organizers, parents, creating schedules of parents to show up and stand guard outside their children's schools. Could you imagine having to do that? There have been so many instances of ICE attacks and the use of chemical weapons that the tear gas has gone into the schools. Organizing with churches, finding safe spaces for migrants to not be kidnapped, organizing general strikes in Minneapolis, which is much less common in the US than it is in Europe. Incidentally, one of the main organizers behind those general strikes was this guy named Kieran, who was one of the founders of anti-racist action in the late 80s in Minneapolis, is still at it today and is involved with the CWA union there and was doing a number of videos and was out organizing and arguing for thinking about the anti-ICE struggle as a working class struggle, because these people that they are capturing are workers, among other things. And this is in a context where the courts have legalized racial discrimination. They've said that it's legal for ICE to apprehend people based on the color of their skin or the language they speak or any of a number of allegedly criminalizing aspects of themselves. And so, for example, my partner is Latina. She was in Chicago for a week before all hell broke loose. And she was staying in a very Latino neighborhood. And she saw ICE coming around, and suddenly a neighborhood that was very vibrant, that people were out and about all the time, was a ghost town, and she rushed home to get her passport because she's an American citizen. And back then, she was reasonably confident that that would suffice to protect her. Now, she wouldn't be nearly as confident because there's so many instances of American citizens being detained, held for weeks, abused. And so this leads me to the concluding bit of what I'm going to say today, is that before Trump took office for his second term, I tried to think about how I would avoid two kinds of extremes in thinking about what was about to happen. The kind of one extreme, I think, was a kind of well-intentioned left-wing radical argument that things are already as bad as they could possibly be right now, so as not to be kind of outflanked by people who think things could be worse. And a kind of a more centrist view that like everything's fine even though it's not fine. Like how do we find where in between the worst case scenario and normality we are? And how far are we down the path to fascism? So without being too long-winded here, I'm going to lay out the three things that I was going to keep an eye on, that I have been keeping an eye on, that I think can give us some sort of a historically informed sense of where we are. The first is attacks on the quality and quantity of rights, broadly construed. Another way of saying that is attacks on the citizenship of people the administration doesn't like. A number of scholars have argued that the kind of white supremacist grievance politics of the 21st century is a way to reclaim or recreate their interpretation of white citizenship from a past era. And so if we think through it in that lens, the inverse would be what they're doing now, which is trying to chip away at it or eliminate it for a number of other people, right? That's the first bit. The second bit was creating forms of repressive violence outside of the law and or the state. Here I was thinking about the sort of Nazi example historically of how institutions like the Gestapo or the concentration camp system were under the jurisdiction of the Nazi party, not the German state. And so a number of scholars have talked about these kinds of parallel repressive structures as being hallmarks of fascism. And then the third one was the use of the rhetoric of emergency. And so I'm going to kind of talk through all three together because I think that one of the easiest ways to talk through all three at the same time is through ICE. Because ICE, although it is a government agency, increasingly acts like it's not, both in the kind of more immediate sense of agents covering their faces, not having name tags, a lack of meaningful civilian oversight. Their budget is astronomical. Their budget is higher than the armed forces of every country in the world with the exception of the US and China. And they have been empowered by the courts to go after people based on identity. They've been encouraged, a number of memos have shown, to intentionally exceed the laws regarding what law enforcement officers can do as far as searching, the use of violence, targeting of civilians. Recently, this would normally be a scandal, but these days nothing's a scandal. Stephen Miller, one of Trump's advisors, told someone in charge of ICE in Minneapolis that they need to, I forgot what he said. He said something along these lines. I probably shouldn't have even brought up this example if I don't remember this example. But if you look at Stephen Miller, recently there was a scandal around that, right? So they're acting more and more like they could be Trump's paramilitary force. They're sending people to immigrant detention centers that have been meaningfully compared to concentration camps insofar as the people there are there based on their identity for the most part, and increasingly, lawyers can't get in touch with their clients. They've developed a strategy of sending detainees from one camp to the other rapidly on this private airline so that people, their family, their lawyers can't figure out where they are. Abuse is rife. People are there's serious human rights abuses here. And then a number of them are deported to countries that aren't even the country of their origin or to El Salvador, places known for human rights abuses. So I think that we can see that in addition to the normalization of sending National Guard soldiers into democratic cities, that there's an effort by the administration to get the American people more and more used to unaccountable armed actors out in society targeting people because of their identity and essentially disappearing them. Like that is a dynamic that's being normalized. And then the third thing is the emergency, because they claim that there is a migrant invasion, rhetoric that I'm sure you've heard before. And everything else that's a problem is allegedly an emergency for Trump. The tariffs that he imposed were allegedly because of an emergency. We apparently have emergencies when it comes to drugs, when it comes to any number of issues. And the language of terrorism is a language of emergency. It is a language of identifying certain forms of violence, which of course are crimes, as being so egregious that they somehow fall beyond the scope of normal law enforcement. So if you start normalizing calling all sorts of people in society terrorists, you are sort of making a case that there need to be exceptional ways to deal with these people, right? So you can see it coming from all different angles in a way that is, of course, not full-fledged fascism yet. We have the Democratic Party. We just had the No Kings protests the other day, which is, of course, the source of a lot of debate on the left as to how good or not good they are, but I'm going to leave that for the moment. So we're not fully there. But what I would argue is that if we're thinking about this as a board game, Trump has moved a lot of pieces into good positions so that if, for example, this war in Iran and Lebanon, which Trump, don't worry, he says it's going to end in 2 weeks, that's going to tank the economy. That's going to provoke a lot of social unrest. It might even instigate some sort of real terrorist attack, create circumstances where Trump could more meaningfully, especially in the context of the midterm elections coming up in November, make the case that we need to delay having them, that certain major Democratic politicians are actually doing these criminal acts and need to be arrested. So I feel like I have kind of these two heads. I have the head that the end is near, run, and, well, but we don't actually know exactly what's going to happen. And so all I'm trying to communicate is this concern and uncertainty. But what does give me hope is that there are millions of people, especially people with no activist background, who are showing up in the streets. And so if kind of like maybe the paradigmatic visual image that you might think of for an anti-fascist from the 1980s maybe would be like this anti-racist punk skinhead person, fighting against fascists in their neighborhood. Today, it's an average person, a parent, with a whistle and a smartphone following ICE around. And that kind of image of popular anti-fascism is really growing. The number of groups in local cities around the U.S. that are mobilizing and training to be able to thwart these kinds of intentions is really inspiring. And hopefully, when all of this crap is gone, will lead to a new generation of people working to make a better world. So I'm going to encourage us to walk away with that hopeful tone, and maybe I'll leave it there.
So thank you very much for this extremely interesting presentation. We will open the floor now for some questions.
Yeah.
Yes. Who has a question? Okay.
Hi. I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. The first one is a little bit around the ethics of the work that you have done with regards to researching anti-fascist movements. I think it's a really great book. I really enjoyed it. I think it's also useful for both academics and for activists. But I did want to ask how you deal with the ethics of doing research on social movement communities, on ostensibly publishing their tactics to a certain degree. What agency do the people that you research have in that context, and how can we as researchers of both fascism and of social movements learn perhaps from your experience?
Okay.
The other question that I have is, I guess, a more strategic question. I do find this image that you give at the end very, very inspiring, but I think it also brings up, I guess, one of the oldest questions of anti-fascism, which is about the alliances that we make and how we make these alliances sustainable in a longer term anti-fascist struggle. How do you create a network of mass popular self-defense that is, I guess, resistant to the pitfalls of liberalism, of a liberal discourse that says, yes, racism is bad, but ostensibly perpetuates and participates in the logics of a racial capitalism that allow fascism to take hold. So how do you create this mass popular self-defense network that, people will show up in the streets now, but how do you create this mass network of popular self-defense that continues beyond the moments when fascism is taking a particularly obvious form and remains in antagonism to systems of domination more generally? Thank you.
Great questions. I'll start with the second one, and I'll work back to the first one. So, building anything really big on the left is hard, right? And that's certainly been the case about anti-fascism as much as anything else. And we can, without getting into all the nitty-gritty, see all of the actual killing that resulted in the 1930s, for example, right? Thinking here particularly of the May Days in Barcelona, but there's other examples as well. So how do you, and I'm presuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you are some kind of a radical leftist, anti-capitalist. Am I pigeonholing you too much? No, all right, well, you don't have to answer that. But I mean, I would consider myself that, for what it's worth. So how do people who have a more radical view on politics work with people who do not? And all the pitfalls that entails. And in the US, you know, your average Democrat, and I know because my mother is one, is someone who really would be largely fine with ICE doing like 80% of what it's doing. And the Democratic Party funded ICE for years and years and years before Trump took power. And there was mass outrage when Alex Priddy and Renee Good were killed in public. White people, non-white detainees have been killed at a much higher rate without the public outcry, right? Just to name a few examples of how that dynamic works out. So, I mean, in a sense, the short answer is you can't. But what you can do, I think, is you can, is this still working? Yeah, is like in any circumstance, radical groups can organize in such a way to try and find people who are questioning and looking for alternative forms of organizing, provide homes for them to get involved in thinking and organizing differently. And I think also there are openings through the efficacy of certain radical ideas and tactics to broaden in ways that gain popular support, not because of the ideas behind them, but because they work, right? And so like there are certain forms of solidarity and mutual aid, and at times even like directly democratic forms of organizing that people will at times adhere to or support or like because they work well in a given context. Doesn't mean they always work well. And so my short answer would be it's a mix of create your radical group, organize, get your ideas out there, influence the public discourse, find people who are looking for different ways of doing things, talk to them, give them your propaganda, not in the modern American sense of misleading discourse, but in the old 19th century sense of like, here's our information, right? And like right now, there's something really interesting going on, right? Prior to this era, the American left was caught up in these violence versus nonviolence debates, all these questions around what is or is not violence. Those debates are not really happening in the U.S. right now, and there's this fascinating kind of anti-fascist consensus where you have Rachel Maddow, who some people write she's one of the most famous progressive pundits in the U.S. She retweeted CrimethInc, which is this kind of more insurrectionary anarchist platform. And I bring that up to say that like pretty much wherever you are on the left, there's people that are to one extent or another really seriously supporting these anti-ICE movements, not calling at the moment openly for more than these forms of community self-defense that are already happening from the ground up because people see them as useful forms of organizing. So that's my short shtick. But yeah, it's a concern, and there's always this back and forth from a radical perspective of influencing society and then having it roll back on you. And I saw that with Occupy Wall Street, right? We tried to normalize this critique of capitalism, this critique of hierarchical forms of organization. We made some progress, we influenced some people, and then it kind of rolled back on us, and then we try again. The other thing about ethics of research and publicizing sort of forms of organizing and so forth. I mean, I conducted a lot of interviews where I was very clear with my interview subjects, like what information here do you want to be shared and do you not? Do you want to share who you are or identifying features of who you are? There were some people I spoke to who said, yeah, sure, I'm public, share whatever. There are other people I spoke to over encrypted forums where I don't actually know their real identity at all. And they shared with me things that were fodder for public consumption. I'm sure there's like 90% of what they could have shared they didn't, and that's fine, right? There's actually an interesting book that's like different from this that I think would be interesting to think about. So the late, great David Graeber, the anthropologist, wrote a really interesting book called Direct Action, where he sat in, and well, not sat in, he was part of an anti-globalization movement in New York City in the early 2000s. He was an activist. And he took copious notes on everything everyone said and everyone did, and wrote an ethnography of an activist meeting. Now, to my knowledge, not everyone there gave consent for that. That raises important questions, which I don't mean to dismiss at all, although it is a fascinating ethnography. So take that for what it will. But I didn't do that. I spoke to people, full disclosure of what I was doing and what the information would be used for, and people consented. And apart from that, I used movement publications and periodicals. I mean, then there's the question of sort of like neutrality, objectivity, which was, I don't know, if you don't care about that, then we'll just move on. If anyone else does, that can be the next question. I'm fine in talking about it, but I just don't want to like, participant, observer, activist, scholar. I don't need to go on and on about that unless you really want to hear it.
Okay, I'll just talk back to my voice as well. Do you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so my name is also Mark. Just a quick question, because the Biennio Rosso in Italy in 1920, 1921, 1922, etc., the capitalist class in a way allied itself with like fascist militia.
Yeah.
Now my question is, we've all seen Elon Musk, seek Heil, but could you expand a bit on the role of like large capital in the US at the moment? And at the same time, fascism was a reaction to the ongoing revolutionary processes in Europe. We haven't seen any such processes in the US.
No.
But instead what we see, and maybe you can talk about it, is like a fascist workerism in which they, use or deploy what you've also mentioned before, like kind of like a workerist image, etc. So maybe you can...
Sure.
And where is the petty bourgeoisie in all of this?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, that's one of the fascinating things about it, is that the communist specter of the 1930s was maybe inflated, but was an actual thing, right? There was a Soviet Union. There were attempted revolutions in a number of different countries at the time. In the U.S. now, like, it's pronouns, gender identity, quote unquote woke, like the destruction of these allegedly natural. They're so natural they need to be defended by the state. Allegedly natural categories is that specter. Is it, and the question I asked myself early on, is it scary enough to these people to actually make them go all the way? Maybe. I don't know. But of course, that's not the whole story, right? So the other thing, I recently, well, not that recently, I read there's an interesting article that's going to become a book called Anti-Fascism by Naomi Klein and Astra Taylor, where they make the case, and this is not the whole story, but it's part of it, that, right, we have these ultra-rich people who are profiting on destroying the planet and know that that's what they're doing and are actually fine with that being what they're doing, and are trying to destroy environmental oversight, regulation to make more money and to create essentially their kind of libertarian in a right-wing sense, imagine, like ideal communities with gates and barbed wire, and they're like special sealed rooms and all the like stupid technology that they think they can save them from a dying planet. And so we see a lot of the mega rich in the U.S. and elsewhere buying into Trump's politics, which is fundamentally trying to destroy what little of a welfare state we have, destroy regulation, destroy the environment, and clear the way for them to make as much money as possible. That having been said, like talking about like workers and working class people, there is a larger story in the U.S. and Europe. And it was even, I think, a story maybe to a lesser extent in the 20s and 30s, like why would workers support the far right and fascism? Because despite what the Communist International said back in the day, there were plenty of workers, although most workers did not support the fascists, there were plenty of fascist and Nazi workers. And today there are plenty in the U.S. as well. Even so, in the last few presidential elections in the U.S., most working class people still voted for the Democrats, but there are millions who did not. And I mean, in the U.S., the story is a little different than in Europe. Obviously, like the role of race and racism, the historical legacy of white workers coming to identify around race differently from class, there's probably a similar conversation to be had about histories of imperialism and white working class Europeans in relation to that, but I'm not going to go down that path. With that, you have a lot of working class people who are far right, but I think that right now, like the culture wars politics are so central to it, and that populist politics need an elite to be against, and as far as they're concerned, that elite is like us in this room, which is, of course, silly, especially if you see the situation that academics are in economically these days. But if you look at their conspiratorial thinking, the Great Replacement Theory being like a paradigmatic example, it is, according to them, people like us who are disseminating all of these corrosive ideas that are destroying all of the natural hierarchies that they think are fundamental to how society works. And no amount of talking about like unions or capitalism or class or economics is going to wash that away entirely for those people. Unfortunately, if it were that easy, then we would have done it already. So, yeah, it's a bummer. Yeah.
I think
Anybody
I'm
else?
Yes. Thank you for the great talk, and also
Thank you.
Thank you very much for ending on a more hopeful note.
I try.
Okay, that will get us, make us get up out of our chairs after your talk. I would like to take the conversation to a different terrain. I hope you don't mind.
That's quite all right.
I wonder about the role of universities, both inward looking and externally. So what do you think is the role of university here in, one, protecting academic personnel like yourself when faced with these kinds of attacks, but maybe also on a more less, impactful way?
Sure.
What is the role of university vis-a-vis its academic personnel, but then also to broader society? What role do you think university should have in protecting freedoms in anti-fascist work? We heard our vice rector research saying, yes, we have to speak out for freedom, but maybe we don't have to go all the way to activism. And I was wondering, when listening to you, how would you position yourself in this question? Do universities need to speak out / get into some kind of activism?
Right. Well, obviously universities are under attack. I mean, particularly in the US right now, not only ideologically, but at the level of funding. What I will say, and I had a really fascinating conversation with a number of colleagues here yesterday, and part of what came up is the differences between universities in Belgium and the US. And my point of reference is really an American perspective, especially when it comes to universities. But in the US, so many of the universities, I think, pretend they don't like what Trump is doing to them, but they love it. They love the opportunity to cut all of these programs that they never wanted to have to begin with, but were forced by the movements of the 60s and 70s to include, like ethnic studies programs or women's and gender studies programs and so forth. I don't know how much that applies to the situation here. But what I will say, though, is I really liked the opening remarks from the vice rectors, where you talk about values, that we can't pretend that we don't have values. We shouldn't pretend that we don't have values. And those values should be broad. They should be inclusive. They should involve a wide range of opinions and perspectives. But that, 1% of ideas that aims to dehumanize members of our community, that aims to destroy entire areas of inquiry and submit our society to a totalitarian hellscape, like that's not in the interest of the university, right? So I think, another practical thing that came up, I think it's useful for universities to understand that in this day and age with social media, that threats against researchers is as central to the experience of being a university as anything else, and to create some kind of an office or a program that's there for professors or faculty or students who are targeted for their research to be able to come to have resources to talk about how to handle it, because right now it's a very ad hoc process. In the U.S., the labor union at my university, which is very supportive of me in my case, is working with the administration to try to create resources like that. Resources not only to help to make sure that people are physically safe, but psychological services, cybersecurity tips, all the range of things that lamentably have become necessary if you research a controversial topic so that you can actually do your job. And one of the things that my union pushes forward is like, this is a workplace safety issue, that if you are hired to research something that people are going to threaten to kill you over, the university should have a role in making sure that you feel safe while you do it, and of espousing these kinds of values of diversity, internationalism, equality, which we value. American institutions played around with that 10 years ago. When there was money in it, they played around with talking about diversity and supporting international students. And then once the wind blew the other way, they were happy to abandon that discourse. Even at my university, Rutgers University, which is relatively, it's in a democratic state, I wasn't fired. I would have been fired at most American universities. So I don't want to cast too many aspersions at Rutgers, but even Rutgers canceled its DEI program, putting aside the conversation around how good or not good these kind of liberal DEI programs are. Succumbing to the larger situation, Syracuse University is cutting something like 20% of its programs. So I think that universities play an important role in safeguarding independent academic thought and as being spaces for these kinds of exchange of ideas. It's no coincidence that the far right wants to destroy these spaces. Either transform them into something else or shut them down. It's not a coincidence, and so we need to recognize that and make sure that they stay these kinds of open, progressive, pluralistic spaces. So, yeah. Who else?
Sorry. Thank you so much. Maybe two short questions. The first one would be basically how can we manage to denazify society? How can we get the incels back into, a more acceptable way of looking at society? Is it too late? Do we still have to convince people who have moved to the other side? And if so, how can we do this? Is there any kind of historical example that you see that could serve as a sort of inspiration for how to do this? And on the other, maybe to end up on a more hopeful note, I was trying to go through any kind of example of fascist adjacent regime that effectively went to power, and it doesn't seem like they survived the death of the leader. Mm-hmm. Do you see, obviously the organization behind Trump will remain once that he's not there anymore, but can it still work as efficiently once that someone else would be in charge?
Yeah, two great questions. I'll start with the second one. My short answer is I don't think MAGA politics are going anywhere anytime soon. But on the other hand, Trump is such a particularly, I hesitate to use this word, but I think it's true, charismatic figure for some people, that there is a particularity to his figure that has propelled MAGA to where it is. And whenever he's out of politics through one means or another, I think that there will be disarray. And we're seeing that there's disarray even now, like, for example, over the question of Israel, that the hegemony of the Zionist position is fraying. So now you have the anti-Semitic Zionists are fighting with the anti-Semitic anti-Zionists, right? So figures like Nick Fuentes, who are just openly anti-Semitic instead of being covertly anti-Semitic, are attacking the U.S. support for Israel. It's fraying along those lines. It's fraying along the war in Iran. That there are some far-right figures who supported Trump because they actually believe that he was not going to get involved in foreign problems, and he did. A friend of mine who went to one of the recent conservative political conferences talked about how there was so much memorializing of Charlie Kirk, but apart from glorifying his legacy, they couldn't agree on anything. And so that's worth bearing in mind, is that, okay, on the left we have all of our debates and so forth, but they have plenty as well. And so my short answer would be I think MAGA is not going anywhere because the fundamental grievances around the things we've discussed are going to continue to be there. And moreover, a big chunk of society in the U.S. and to some extent elsewhere have come to see their kind of misogynistic, transphobic, racist perspectives as like central to who they are and what they're doing. That having been said, I'm not sure what the exact political trajectory of it will be with Trump gone. There's no one, it seems to me, in the conservative camp who's primed to be the next figure like him, but there could be someone who is not that famous now who in 5 years shows up and does that. Also, I don't think that there's any obviously really capable Democratic presidential candidates who are obviously going to win, which doesn't, that's relevant as well. The first question of like, that this is central to the politics of anti-fascism is what role does convincing have? How do people come up with their ideas? How do the ideas get changed? There are documented cases of people changing their minds, going from far right to center or to left. It happens, but it happens not nearly as often as we would like it to. And so that's why like my historical and political focus has been on like social norms and taboos and like how we create consequences in our societies for people who are openly hateful, in the sense of being like, we don't welcome that in our group. We don't welcome that in our university, in our society. And those kinds of taboos, those kinds of social norms have a tremendous power at the level of societies, families, religious congregations, and so forth. And so I would focus more on like how do we create a culture not only that sanctions that, but also welcomes in people who want to change their mind, not because we've convinced them, but because they've come to see more potential belonging in a more holistic, open thing. It makes me think of the Super Bowl halftime show. Did any of you watch Bad Bunny? So my partner is, well, I call her a big fan, and she's like, no, if you know other Latinas, I'm not that big a fan, but like for me, she's a big fan, and she's watched it like 25 times. And it was a huge deal for people like her to have this moment of triumphant Latino, Latinx cultural presence in society. And at the same time, Turning Point USA, the organization that was harassing me, had their competing halftime show. Were you all aware of that? With like Kid Rock and Ted Nugent or whoever. And it was pathetic. And so I'm hoping that moving forward, there can be more of that projected out into the culture of spaces where, hey, like we're having more fun over here. Like, come over here. You don't want to go to that halftime show. You want to go to this halftime show. But the thing that, there's the last comment I'll say before that is though that, like, the more successful that becomes, the more it creates even more rage in people who aren't going to do it. And that doesn't mean that we're doing it wrong. But that's a necessary byproduct. Whenever you have successful progressive movements, successful social movements, leftist movements, there's always a backlash, and that's just baked into what it is. And so at a political level, at a social level, we need to be prepared for that and manage it. It doesn't mean we're doing it wrong. It just means that things don't change without a struggle. Yeah.
Any other questions?
There's a few in the back.
Oh, yes.
Thank you very much for trying to strike a hopeful tone at the end. And so I don't want to sound like a doomsayer, but
that's okay.
I just have a question regarding the midterms.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be a big milestone in that story, I'm assuming. And
yeah.
One thing that keeps me awake at night sometimes is that it doesn't seem like the Trump administration is behaving like an administration that cares about the results of that election. It seems that they're engaging into a lot of policies that are unpopular and that they know to be unpopular. And they don't, and surprisingly, I think surprisingly, they don't seem to care. And so my question is, could you reassure us that they'll like stand by the results of the elections?
Oh, no.
Or do you think that it is possible that they are going to try to circumvent the elections or distort the results or whatever?
Yeah. So I think I 95% agree with you on that. I mean, the few asterisks which are not that significant are, like, I think of how there was political blowback that seemed to have a slightly significant impact in the wake of the Customs and Border Patrol and ICE killings of Renee Good and Alex Priddy, that Kristi Noem was fired, although it may have been to get out in front of what was going on with her husband, but that's another story. And that Trump said we need a softer touch. Now, that's that's rhetoric, but it had an effect to the point where a number of liberals believed the discourse that, oh, that's over in Minneapolis. It was never over. It's not over now. They're still there. But we haven't seen a similar monstrous surge in another American city since then. I think in part because it was wildly unpopular. So I think that they are somewhat cognizant of that, and I think that there may be the case, and this might make them in some ways even more dangerous, that they recognize that, you know, instead of the volume being turned up to 11 in Minneapolis, let's make it an 8. That is a small piece, but I think that they're actually probably thinking about it in a few different interrelated ways. One is like they would like to get as many votes as possible, sure. They also want to suppress as many votes as possible, and that's been the product of like a generation of Republican policy on a local level, at a national level. And there's all sorts of ways that they are trying to suppress the vote, gerrymander the elections to try and rig it, not only for this election, but just for all elections in the future. There's the role of the men with guns, whether National Guard or ICE or federal agents. And we've seen, if ICE goes into a neighborhood with a lot of people of color, particularly of Latin American ancestry, a lot of people are going to be scared to go vote. They're going to be scared to leave their house. So if you want to influence a key district in a key state where there's a lot of predominantly Democratic voters, that's one way to really put your finger on the scale. So, no, I can't. Trump has basically made it clear that Republicans never lose fairly. I mean, not only did he say that he lost in 2020 because of cheating, he's also said that even when he won in 2024, the Democrats were still cheating. He was just so popular, he won even though they were cheating. So for him, cheating from Democrats is constant. And so they'll never accept, it seems, MAGA-aligned politicians won't accept defeat, especially in this age of deep fakes and misinformation and fake news. They're going to come up with ways to say that they really won. And so I guess the question for me is like, sure, voter suppression, men with guns, will it get to a point where they come up with some sort of excuse to delay the elections? That would be a little difficult because it's a federal system and there's local state boards, but hypothetically, Trump could go in and have some people detained who are in charge of elections or send men with soldiers in so that effectively it doesn't actually function. And even if some people vote, it'll be called not a legitimate election because a lot of people didn't vote. I think a lot of democratic process has a really strong faith in certain important people doing the things they're supposed to do. And if they stop doing those things, it's actually a lot weaker than it looks. And I think we're finding that out in the U.S. And so I don't have much optimism in it, but I don't actually know what's going to happen, of course.
Okay. So in this period of just constant misinformation, constant attack into minorities and everything, I mean, I have family in the U.S. and me as a Latin, I get very raged by everything that community goes through. And I just want to ask, maybe based on history, like since you're a historian and all, like how can we as people wake up this sort of rage for the good, and also to make like people that themselves are immigrants, in the case of the U.S., to open their eyes and just stop like covering their ears and everything, to just like make them realize that it's not because they got papers or because of that they will never be touched, like that they're immune to it, but to sort of start developing and making this wake of critical thinking, actually, because I think that with misinformation a lot goes through it. I mean, I've seen on the social media, for example, saying this, but in the end somebody comes up and it's like, no, it was in the news and it's completely false what you're saying here. But as a community, like how to raise this cooperation, this help, because I mean, Bad Bunny said it, and I also believe in that by helping others and having this cooperative mind, we can get through it. But how can we, in sort of a way, wake these people's like ignorance? I know, because you can be very educated and just have the least education as possible, yet you can have a very common, and I would say like shitty mindset that would just start destroying everyone. And it's just like very selfish, because I know capitalism is one of the issues, but how as a society can we build into these values and just like shortly move forward into something more hopeful?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say that in the most general sense possible, everyday people get involved in things when it starts to impact them directly. And that's kind of how it's always been and probably how it always will be. And so in a way, we've seen some of the good part of that in the US, and so insofar as a lot of people have had this brought to their communities and are responding and have had their minds changed. And a sense of pride in their city or in their neighborhood has been a mobilizing factor in a number of different places. The inverse of that is that there are people who live in towns where there really aren't many ICE agents. Remember, the US is an enormous country, and as many ICE agents as there are plenty of places where they're just not that active, who don't think much of anything has changed. And so not to venture into the realm of prediction, which is a wary field, probably the most successful version of an authoritarian future for Trump would be some sort of competitive authoritarianism where so many Americans don't think anything's changed. And so how do you reach people who aren't directly affected by that? That's awfully difficult. Activists have been trying to do that in all sorts of times and places in all sorts of ways. Sometimes they have success, sometimes they don't. I don't have a magic bullet for that, but I do think that ultimately my fundamental activist opinion advice is wherever you are, try to get some people together to do something in whatever kinds of way. If you're at a university with other students or other faculty, if you're at a different workplace with your other coworkers in your community, find people where you are and try to put something together to be ready for mobilizing when something happens. I think that's like the building block of politics. And hopefully in doing that, you'll bump into a local grievance that you can talk to people about and bring people in on things. But there's no magic bullet on it, and I don't have a solution. It's a problem.
I have another question. Now that it came to mind, I have forgotten it before. How would you try to find ways to make people that avoid politics, make them take this curiosity towards it? I know we always have to target them and just awake their emotions, rage mostly, for them to properly start looking at it. But how would be like some ways maybe that we can start influencing people that, regardless of the corruption that we see everywhere, to just like start engaging, maybe just reading the news or something? I mean, because, okay, we can say, if I talk to you in economical words, you'll get targeted because of inflation, the tariffs. I mean, but I mean, in society, how could you just like, okay, start in the small group, but also like to just incentivize people that politics is also important. Because I find it sad when people say like, I don't read politics.
Yeah.
I mean, this does not touch me, but of course, because it's very far. But how could be some other movements? I mean, maybe you already answered and you don't have the proper answer to it.
That's
because,
fine.
Of course, activism is a thing. But to just, have people more engaged into it. I know there's this security measure and the violence in it because people are losing their values. I mean, the ethics is gone beyond the floor. Yeah. But
so the one thing I would say about it is sort of goes back to the earlier thing, is that a lot of people don't get involved in politics because of ideas or reading, unfortunately. If that were how it worked, like we'd have this wrapped up already. I think a lot of it is being affected personally, materially, but also feeling part of a community. And so I remember I was in a library in Barcelona in 2010 researching the Spanish Revolution, anarchism in the 1930s. And this guy in his 90s stops at the table, points at my anarchist youth book and said, yeah, I was part of that. And I was like, wait, don't go anywhere. Come back here. Come talk to me. And he was like 16 in 1936. He was not like a political kid, but he said the anarchists threw great parties. And so he got involved with the parties and the youth scene. He came away with a few kinds of anti-authoritarian ideas. And then after the war, he went to Venezuela. But he said those ideas affected him for the rest of his life. He came back to Barcelona after the war. But that's my 2 cents is, again, like creating community, creating incentives to get involved in politicized spaces, because people are so isolated and atomized that if we can give them that, we're not necessarily going to turn them into a political theorist. But we don't need that. We just need that sense of identification with some core values around justice.
If no one else has a question, I have plenty. There's another question. I remember reading Ian Kershaw, The Nazi Dictatorship, in which he says that it's really complicated for fascists to get to power if they don't get the support of enablers, especially the conservatives.
Yeah.
And that's true if you look at Romania, where they had the largest fascist party. It never came to power because conservatives never formed a coalition with them.
Right.
My question is there any hope with anything like the Lincoln Project, for instance, the U.S.? Do you think that by being able to detach some of the old school Republicans from the Trumpian MAGA movement, there is any chance that you could try and have a wedge through the Republican Party, or is it something?
You heard much from George W. Bush recently? Mitt Romney? I won't mention John McCain. It's not his fault. But the centrist Republicans have disappeared, right? You'd think they were the ones under attack. They've gone into hiding, right? So that having been said, though, at the level of votes, there are plenty of people in the U.S. who don't consider themselves part of one party or the other, who just call it like they see it, right? That's, of course, a very gendered political performance, particularly men. I'll decide based on the candidates and their positions, who would I want to have a beer with, who are getting turned off by what's going on now. And if we have a real presidential election in 2028, after what's happening with the economy, with this ridiculous war, with all these problems, there's a lot of guys who voted for Trump who are going to say that we just need to kind of return to normal. That's the minimalist hope for some sort of return to the abnormal normalcy that prevailed before. That raises real questions as to the question before about what will the Republican Party look like moving forward. There are some states that are more battleground states where it's clear that Republicans are losing if they're identified with Trump. So in New Jersey, when there was an election for governor in the fall, the Republican candidate, Chitterelli, was actually campaigning with the Turning Point students who harassed me. He was on stage with them. He lost, but all the Democratic candidate had to do was say, he's with Trump. I'm not, but he is. And then he lost. So it's clear, especially as these polling numbers are going down, that in a number of states, not all, but maybe 10 states, there's a real liability for Republican candidates of being perceived as being too close to Trump. That might end up being the seeds of something that changes things. We might end up with some sort of MAGA light. But there are some positions that are MAGA positions that even those centrist Republicans have jumped in on wholeheartedly, which are not going anywhere. And so, it's what shades of brown shirt are we talking about here?
Any more questions? If not, then I think there's a reception waiting for us. I just want to thank, again, the speaker, Mark Bray, for his great talk, and also the audience for joining us today. As you know, this is also lecture was part of the BRIAS program. So we have this program on democratic governance, and we organize weekly seminars on Thursdays, and also sometimes lectures on other days. So you're more than welcome to join us every week. The program is on the website of BRIAS, so feel free to take a look. But then let's enjoy the reception first.